Good evening. My name is Vasiliki Kolokotroni, and on behalf of the university and its Gifford committee, I would like to welcome you all to this suitably magnificent venue on the magnificent occasion of Judith Butler's visit to Glasgow. And of course, you're a magnificent audience in your own right. Professor Butler's talk last night, which was the first of 3 on the Gifford lecture series, engaged us all, I think it's fair to say, and it energized us. And I know it generated discussion already across the university and beyond. I know that the sequel tonight and the final lecture tomorrow are eagerly anticipated. So without further ado, I shall hand you over to Professor Judith Butler.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming back. I thought I would proceed to give the second lecture, and then at the end, I will turn to some of the questions that were submitted to me in writing, and I'm glad to try to answer them as best as I can, but then we'll also have a chance to receive lectures from the hall itself, so worry not. We might even have a bit more time than we had last night, we'll see. So in this second lecture, I propose to pose a relatively simple question, one that we might immediately identify as belonging to moral psychology or perhaps moral philosophy. What leads any of us to seek to preserve the life of the other? I'm aware that there are debates about the preservation of life that now inform medical ethics, debates on reproductive freedom, euthanasia and technology, healthcare, law enforcement, and prisons. I won't be entering into those debates in detail, although some of what I have to say will, I think, have implications for how we enter those debates. I want rather to point out a feature of debates about when and where the preservation of life is called for, and to suggest that we invariably make some assumptions about what counts as a life, not only when and where it begins or how it ought to end, but also, perhaps in another register, the question of whose lives count as living. So when we ask the question, why seek to preserve the life of the other, we could be asking about what motivates us to do so, or we could be asking about what justifies actions of that kind, or indeed what establishes refusing or failing to preserve a life as morally unjustifiable. The first question is psychological, though clearly a question of moral psychology. The second belongs to moral philosophy or to ethics, fields that sometimes rely on moral psychology to make their claims. But do these questions also overlap with social theory and political philosophy? Much depends on how we pose the question and what assumptions we make when we pose it. For instance, it makes a difference if we pose the question about a singular other person. What leads any of us to seek to preserve the life of this other person? That question is different from asking whether we seek to preserve the lives of some particular group, one with which we strongly identify, or indeed a vulnerable group that seems to us in danger of violence or destruction, or whether we're talking about all who count as living. Asking what leads us to seek to preserve the life of a particular other person presumes a dyadic relation. You may be someone I know or someone I do not know, but I may, under certain circumstances, be in a position to ward off danger or to stop a destructive force that threatens your life. What do I do and why do I do it, and what justifies the action that I finally take? That question seems to belong to moral philosophy, though in no way does it exhaust the range of questions considered by that field. Asking whether we seek to preserve the life of some particular group, asking what justifies actions of that kind, presumes what we might well call a biopolitical consideration. It not only asks that we consider what counts as a life, but whose lives count as worthy of preservation. Under certain conditions, it makes sense to ask whose life counts as a life, even when that formulation seems to founder in tautology. I will return to this question of biopolitics, or indeed necropolitics, as Achille Mbembe calls it, in my third lecture. But for now, let us return to the first question with which I began. What leads any of us to seek to preserve or safeguard the life of the other? It's a question that in some form has to be asked not just of individuals, but also of institutional arrangements, economic systems, and forms of government. What structures and institutions are in place to safeguard the life of a population, or indeed every population? We will turn to psychoanalysis to see what grounds are given there for not taking a life and for seeking to preserve one. It is not a matter of thinking about the relation of individual to group psychology, for the two invariably overlap, and even our very singular and subjective dilemmas implicate us in a broader political world. The I and the you, the they and the we are implicated in one another, and those implications are not only logical, they are lived out as in the form of ambivalent social bonds, ones that constantly pose the ethical demand to negotiate aggression. So if we start the moral inquiry with the uncritical use of the I, or indeed the we have occluded a prior and pertinent inquiry that considers how both the singular and plural subject are formed and contested by the relations that it seeks to negotiate through moral reflection. Who then is the we called upon to preserve the lives of others? Who are the others, whether individuals or groups of others, whose lives are in need of preservation? Are the lives of those who ask the question the same as the lives about whom the question is asked? For those of us who pose the question, do we consider that our own lives are worthy of preservation, and if so, who is called upon to preserve them? Or is it rather that we presume the worthiness of our lives, presume that everything will be done to preserve our lives, such that we, whoever we are, ask this question about others who do not live with the same presumptions? Is the we really separable from those other lives who do not live with such presumptions? If there is a we who seeks to solve this problem, and then there are others who are the recipient of our deliberations, do we assume a certain divide, arguably a paternalistic one, between those who have or are invested with the power to preserve life, or those for whom there exists a power that seeks already to preserve our lives, and those whose lives are in danger of not being preserved, indeed those whose lives are imperiled by a form of violence, either deliberate or negligent, and whose survival can only be countered by another sort of power? This happens, for instance, when we talk about vulnerable groups, when vulnerable groups are identified. On the one hand, the discourse on vulnerable groups or vulnerable populations that has been important to both feminist human rights work and the ethics of care tells us something very important about social reality, who is at risk and who is not. If a group is called vulnerable, it gains the status to make a claim for protection. Indeed, on some of the Greek islands, if you are a refugee who has come there and you're seeking to gain mobility into Europe, you must fill out your vulnerability paper. In other words, you must have your vulnerability status known and stamped, right? So then, of course, the question emerges: to whom is that claim addressed, and which group emerges as charged with the protection of the vulnerable? On the other hand, have the ones who bear responsibility for vulnerable groups become divested of vulnerability through that designating practice? Those people are vulnerable, we are not vulnerable. Of course, the point is to highlight the unequal distribution of vulnerability, and that is a truth, a social truth of our times, indeed throughout history. But if the designation implicitly distinguishes between vulnerable and invulnerable groups and charges the invulnerable with the obligation to protect the vulnerable, well, that formulation seems to introduce two problems. First, it treats groups as if they are already constituted as vulnerable or as not vulnerable. Second, it fortifies a paternalistic form of power at the very moment in which reciprocal social obligations are most urgently required, and when the agentic and even the agentic powers and the powers of social transformation that belong to the vulnerable are themselves effaced through that categorization. So those of us who understand ourselves as responding to an ethical claim to preserve life, to protect life, may find ourselves subscribing to a social hierarchy in which, for moral reasons, the vulnerable are distinct from the paternalistically powerful, or the invulnerable. It's of course possible to claim that such a distinction is descriptively true for a specific time and place. These people are vulnerable here and now and for this reason. But when it becomes the basis of a moral reflection, well, then a social hierarchy is given a moral rationalization, and moral reasoning is pitted against the aspirational norm of a shared or reciprocal condition of equality. It would be awkward, if not fully paradoxical, if a politics based on vulnerability ended up fortifying hierarchies and forms of paternalistic power that are most urgently in need of dismantling. So I begin today first by posing a question about the psychological motivations for preserving another's life, or the lives of others in the plural. And I've sought to show that such a question, perhaps in spite of itself, opens onto a political problem concerning the management of demographic differences and the ethical ruses of paternalistic forms of power. Of course, my inquiry still leaves critically unexplored key terms such as life, the living, what it means to preserve, to protect, to safeguard, whether these can be thought as reciprocal actions rather than paternalistic ones, which would imply that those who potentially preserve the lives of others are potentially also in need of preservation, and that that's what constitutes the equality among them, and that what that implies about potentially shared conditions of vulnerability and exposure, and what kind of social and political organization that requires. Now, my inquiry in these lectures is meant to ask about the possibility of safeguarding life against modes of destruction, including the kinds of destruction that we ourselves have the capacity to unleash. My wager is that it is not only that we find ways to preserve the lives that we ourselves have the power to destroy, but also that the preservation of life requires infrastructures organized with that purpose in mind. Of course, there are infrastructures that are destructive, infrastructures that aim to destroy. So infrastructure alone is not a sufficient condition for the preservation of life. My point is, how can we, or my question is, how can we build a world such that the infrastructural conditions for the preservation of life are reproduced and strengthened? An ethos of nonviolence, whatever that might prove to be, will turn out, I think, to be different from both moral philosophy and moral psychology, though a consideration of moral inquiry takes us to that very insight. When we take moral psychology as a point of departure, as Freud surely did when considering the origins of destructiveness and aggression, our reasoning makes sense only in light of fundamental political structures, including assumptions we make about how destructive potential inheres in social bonds. One could claim, of course, lives appear one way or the other only from specific historical perspectives. They acquire and lose value depending on the framework in which they are regarded. And many people are highly regarded in one community that values their lives and highly disregarded or abandoned in another social framework that considers their lives dispensable. Indeed, part of the crazy-making character of contemporary life is that people live with that kind of radical dissonance. One could claim that there's a continuum of the grievable, but that framework doesn't let us understand those conditions in which a life is at once actively mourned within one community and remains unmarked, unmarkable, and ungrievable within a dominant national or international frame. And yet this happens all the time. Someone is not named but counted as collateral damage and justified through a military exercise in one framework, but that person with a name and a history is actively mourned precisely within the community that knows that person or is part of that person's broader life. One reason why the community that mourns also protests the fact that the life that is lost is considered ungrievable by those who took that life, by those who live in a world where the presumption is that lives such as these are always vanishing, or that this is simply the way things go. Mourning becomes protest under such conditions. And the two have to go together when losses are not marked and mourned. The mournful protest, and here we can think of Women in Black or Las Abuelas in Argentina, or the families of the Ayotzinapa 43, are making the claim that these lost lives ought not to have been lost, that they remain grievable, they should have been regarded as such way before any injury was done. They embody this claim in their mourning, but also in the public expression of their political anger. So one normative aspiration of this work, my work, is to formulate a political imaginary of the radical equality of grievability. It's not just that we all have a right to mourn the dead, though we do, and it's not just that the dead also have a right to be mourned, but I think they do. There's a difference between someone being grieved and that same person in their living being bearing the characteristic of grievability. The second involves an experimentation that uses the conditional tense. Those who are grievable would be mourned if their lives were lost. The ungrievable are those whose loss leaves no trace or perhaps barely a trace. So if I were to call for the radical equality of all those who are grievable, I would not be able to focus on the way that grievability is differentially allocated such that some do not rise to the level of the grievable, cannot be grasped as lives worth mourning. In the same way that we talk about the unequal distribution of goods or resources, I believe we can also speak about the radically unequal distribution of grievability. That does not mean that there's some center of power that distributes grievability according to some calculus. It may mean that a calculation of this sort pervades regimes of power in more or less tacit ways. And though some may think that I'm calling for everyone to cry in the face of another's death, even someone you do not know, when I ask how we might grieve for those we do not know. My point is slightly different. I want to suggest that grieving or marking grievability, which is different, can take on an impersonal form when the loss is not proximate, when it is at a distance, or when in fact it is nameless. To say that a life is grievable is to claim that a life, even before it is lost, is or will be worthy of being grieved on the occasion of its loss. The life has value in relation to mortality. One treats a person differently if one brings the sense of the grievability of the other to one's ethical bearing toward that other. And if an other's loss would register as a loss, would be marked and mourned, if the prospect of loss is feared, and if precautions are taken to safeguard that life from harm or destruction, then our very ability to value and safeguard a life depends upon an ongoing sense of its grievability, the conjectured future of its non-being. I tentatively am articulating an ethic that is bound up with a specific political imaginary, what I've been calling an egalitarian imaginary, one that requires a conjectural way of proceeding, a way of experimenting with the conditional. Only lives that would be grieved if they were lost qualify as grievable lives, and these are lives actively and structurally protected from violence and destruction. This use of the grammatical form of what I think is the second conditional is one way of experimenting with the potential, postulating what would follow if all lives were regarded as grievable. It might let us see how a utopic horizon opens up in the midst of our consideration of whose lives matter and whose lives do not, or whose lives are more likely to be preserved and whose lives are more likely to be abandoned. Let us, in other words, embed our ethical reflections within an egalitarian imaginary. The imaginary life turns out to be an important part of this reflection, and as I hope to argue, a condition for the practice of nonviolence. For the most part, when we confront moral dilemmas regarding the conditions under which life should be preserved, we formulate hypotheses and then test them by imagining various scenarios. If I were a Kantian, I might ask whether, if I act in a certain way, I can, without contradiction, will that everyone act in that same way, or at least in accord with the same moral precept. For Kant, the question is whether one commits a contradiction or acts reasonably in willing as one does. He gives us a negative and a positive formulation. I ought never to act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law. That's a negative formulation. But on another occasion, he writes, act always on that maxim whose universality as a law you can at the same time will. Positive. One example he offers is that of the false promise made to extricate oneself from a difficult situation. That route seems not to work, for, he writes, I become aware at once that I can indeed will to lie, but I can by no means will a universal law of lying. Others, he claims, would pay me back in like coin, and my maxim, as soon as it was made a universal law, would be bound to annul itself. I take it that I cannot reasonably will that false promising become a universal practice, not simply because I do not like the possibility that I may be lied to in return. I have to imagine that possibility, however, to understand the contradictory character of the maxim. For consequentialists, of course, the imperative to imagine the consequences of living in a world in which everyone would act as you choose to act leads to the conclusion that some practices are utterly untenable, not because they are irrational, but because they inflict consequential damage that is unwanted. In both cases, I would suggest, a potential action is figured as hypothetically reciprocal. One's own act comes back in the imagined form of another's act. Another might act on me as I would act on the other, and the consequences are unacceptable because of those damaging consequences. For Kant, the damage is done to reason, and myself as a reasoning being, but not for all moral philosophers who engage the hypothetical in that way. The broader question is whether one would want to live in a world in which others acted in the same way that I propose to act when I posit a set of violent acts. Again, we could conclude that it would be irrational to will one thing for myself that I could not possibly will for another. Or we might conclude that the world itself would not be livable if others were to act in the way that I propose to act, and then we would be indexing a threshold of livability. In either moral experiment, one imagines a potentially destructive act reciprocated. It's not exactly my act. It is an act that I imagine, and as such has something of me in it, to be sure, but I have assigned it to a possible someone, and so I've taken a bit of distance from the act itself. When the act that impresses itself upon me as the potential act of another, by another, I should not really be surprised, since I started by distancing myself from the act that I myself was considering. If the act is not mine, then whose is it? Paranoia begins this way. My postulation is that such a form of imagining intersects with psychoanalysis and its account of fantasy in some important ways. One's action comes back to one in the form of another's action. That action might be duplicated, or, in the case of aggression, it could be figured as emanating from the other and directed against oneself. In scenes of persecutory fantasy, the imagined return of one's own aggression through an external figure is hardly a livable situation. If we ask what links the act of imagining the reciprocated act within moral philosophy, how would it be if others acted as I propose to act, and the reversals that take place in fantasy, whose aggression is it that comes back toward me in external form? Could that be my own? We may understand the act of imagining reciprocal action as crucial to an understanding of the ways in which one's own aggression becomes bound up with another's. This is not simply a mirror of projections or a cognitive misfire, but rather a way of thinking about aggression as part of social relations themselves. If the act that I imagine doing can in principle be the one that I also suffer, then there is no way to separate the reflections on individual conduct from the reciprocal relations that constitute social life. This postulation will turn out to be important for the argument I hope to make about the equal grievability of lives. I realize I'm asking you to hold a lot of things in place, but I'm going to circle back around and gather up the pieces, at least I hope I do. My suggestion is that the site where moral philosophy is quite radically implicated in psychoanalytic thought is the phantasmatic dimension of substitutability, the idea that one person can be substituted for another, and that this happens quite often in psychic life. Let me then briefly recast one version of a consequentialist view in light of this thesis. If I contemplate an act of destructiveness, and I imagine that others might do as I plan to do, I may end up casting myself as the recipient of that action. That might result in a persecutory fantasy strong enough to dissuade me from acting as I thought I might or surely wished. The thought that others might do as I propose to do, or that others might do to me what I propose to do to others, proves to be unmanageable. Of course, if I become convinced that I will be persecuted, not realizing that the action I imagine is in part my own imagined action, carrying my own wish, then I might construct a rationale for acting aggressively against an aggression that is coming at me from the outside. I can use the persecutory phantasm as a justification for for my own acts of persecution. Rather circular. Makes the case for everybody going into psychoanalysis for a while. This is all the more tragic or comic when one realizes that it's my own aggression that comes toward me in the form of the other's action, and against which I now, with moral justification, aggressively seek to defend myself. It is my action, but I assign it to another's name, and as misguided as that substitution may be, it nevertheless compels me to consider that what I do can be done to me. I say consider, but this is not always a reflective procedure, as we know. Once a substitution becomes subject to fantasy, there are involuntary associations that follow. So though the experiment may start quite consciously, those kinds of substitutions of me for another, of another for me, implicate me in an involuntary set of responses that suggest that the process of substitution, the psychic susceptibility to substitution, involves a primary and transitive mimesis that cannot be fully orchestrated or restrained by a deliberate act of mind. In other words, there could be a confusion about what is me and what is not me that I cannot readily get a hold of through deliberate means. In some ways, substitution is, or this susceptibility to substitution, is prior to the very emergence of the I that I am, operating prior to any conscious deliberation. So when I consciously, deliberately set myself the task of substituting others for me or substituting myself for others, I may well become susceptible to an unconscious domain that undercuts the deliberate character of my experiment. Something is thus experimenting with me in the midst of my experiment. It's not fully under my control. And this point will prove to be important to the question why any of us should preserve the life of the other, since the question I pose reverses and expands in the course of its formulation and is ultimately recast as a scene of reciprocal action. It can be persecutory, but perhaps it can be something else. As a result, in seeing how my life and the life of the other can be substituted for one another, they seem to be not so fully separable. They're not the exact same. They're not merged because substitution depends on separate terms. The links between us exceed any that I may have consciously chosen. It may be that the act of hypothetically substituting myself for another or another for me brings us to a broader consideration of the reciprocal damage done by violence, the violence, as it were, done to reciprocal social relations themselves. And yet sometimes this very capacity of substituting oneself for another and another for oneself can build up a world that leads to greater violence, right? It might convince us not to commit violence, but sometimes it leads to greater violence. Why is this the case? Well, one reason I would suggest we cannot, or rather may not, take away the lives of others we would rather see gone is that we cannot consistently live in a world in which everyone did the same. To apply this measure to our actions means that we have to imagine a world in which we do act that way. We set ourselves on the road to action and query whether there are grounds to stop ourselves. We have to imagine the consequences of our murderous action, and that involves passing through a disturbing fantasy, one that I would suggest is not altogether consciously orchestrated. For to imagine that the other might die because of me suggests already that the reverse might be true. I might die at the hands of the other. And yet, I may well compartmentalize my beliefs so that I imagine my action as unilateral and unreciprocated, which means that I would have become split off from entertaining the possibility of dying at the hands of the other. I would become invulnerable in that fantasy. All the vulnerability would be on the side of the other. If one's beliefs are founded on such a denial or such a splitting, what consequences would that have for how one understands oneself? In performing the thought experiment, one might conclude that others would seek to destroy me, or that they surely will, so that I will be a fool if I don't destroy them first. And yet, if we ask on what that perception of others' intent on destroying me is based, it seems to me that we have to be brought back to the aggression that is my own and the aggression that is a potential in all social relations. So one question I'm posing in a larger way is, given this possibility of destructiveness, given this aggression, what possibility is there for nonviolence? It would not be a form of nonviolence that suppresses or disavows that aggression. It would emerge in the midst of that aggression, as it were, in the force field of aggression itself. Now, Freud was not convinced that reason had the power to order and constrain what he called murderous wishes, and he made this remark on the brink of war. And we can see how a form of circular reason can function as an instrument of aggression, whether that aggression is desired or feared. Given the reality of destructive urges, Freud argued that ethical severity is surely required, or at least that was his argument in 1915. At the same time, he wondered whether ethical severity could really do the job. And in Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud makes a joke that the ethical severity of the superego, and I quote, does not trouble itself enough about the facts of the mental constitution of human beings, since, in his words, the ego does not have unlimited mastery over the id, right? So the superego says, do not kill, right? And expects that the addressee is actually a conscious, deliberate agent. But the murderous wish moves beneath or beyond the conscious and deliberate sphere of the psyche itself. Freud claims that the commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself, is, he writes, the strongest defense against human aggressiveness and an excellent example of the unpsychological proceedings of the cultural superego, end quote. He's suggesting the cultural superego take some psychology classes. Okay, good. Earlier in his reflections on war and death, he writes that no matter how elaborate our rational commitments might be, in our unconscious, I quote again, we hourly and daily do away with all those who have insulted or harmed us. Or again, if we are to be judged by our unconscious wishes, we ourselves are nothing but a band of murderers, end quote. Freud points out that we may indeed wonder that evil should appear again so actively in persons who have received a moral education, and there he is reflecting on Germans with their extraordinary education emerging into fascism. Something remains either uneducable or resistant to education, and this happens especially when, he suggests, individuals meld with groups. We ought not to understand the power of what Freud calls this unconquerable dimension of psychic reality that he comes to associate with the death drive. Though we have focused briefly on the desire to kill and even on what restrains us from killing, we can see that the death drive operates within political deliberations that are quite dissociated from the toll that they actually take on human life. We might think about collateral damage as a prime instance of this kind of reasoning, one based on a disavowal that is effectively the instrument through which destruction happens. Right? Without the disavowal, the destruction could not happen as easily. We can find plenty of evidence of a resistance to legal and political forms of reciprocity, an insistence on the justification of colonial rule, a willingness to let others die through disease or lack of nutrition, or perhaps through closing the ports of Europe to newcomers and letting them drown en masse, even though those bodies may well wash up on the shores of Europe's most coveted resorts. But also, there is sometimes a contagious sense of the uninhibited satisfactions of sadism, as we have seen in police actions against Black communities in the United States, when unarmed Black men running away from police are shot down with ease and with moral impunity and satisfaction, as if those killed were hunted prey, and then later exonerated fully by courts of law. Or again, the stubborn arguments against climate change by those who understand that if we admit to its reality, we would be forced to limit the expansion of industry and the market economy. Those who deny climate change know that destruction is happening, but they prefer not to know, and in this way arrange not to give a damn whether or not it happens, as long as they make a profit during their lifetimes. In such a case, destructiveness happens by default. Even if it is never said or thought, there is a "I don't give a damn about destruction" that gives license to destruction, and perhaps even a sense of satisfactory liberation in opposing checks on industrial pollution and market expansion. We see as well in our contemporary political life how many people thrill to the various ways that the contemporary occupant of the White House calls for the lifting of prohibitions against racist policy and action against violence, right? Lift those prohibitions. Don't be inhibited in expressing violence in that way. For it seems that what he proposes and what he stands for is the so-called liberation of the populace from the cruel and weakening superego represented by the left, especially its feminist, queer, and anti-racist proponents, right? We've become the cultural superego against which a liberation is planned. Any position against violence cannot afford to be naive. It has to take seriously the destructive potential that is a constitutive part of social relations, or what some would call the social bond. But if we take seriously something called the death drive, and we don't worry for a moment about whether this is a drive in the sense of, in some physiological or biological sense, Freud called the drive his mythology, right? So let's just hold it in place as something that recurs propulsively and that is not fully conscious. In any case, if we take this seriously, the death drive, also defined as aggression or destructiveness, we have to consider more generally the kind of dilemma a moral precept against destruction poses for psychic life. Is this a moral precept that seeks to do away with our aggressiveness, with our capacity for destruction? If it cannot do that, and indeed it cannot, does it have another option besides strengthening the superego and its severe and cruel demands of renunciation? Well, one Freudian response to this question is that the renunciation of such impulses is the best we can hope for, though then we pay the psychic cost with a form of morality that now unleashes cruelty on our own impulses. The dictum might be understood this way: murder your own murderous impulse, right? Use your murderous impulse to murder your murderous impulse. But of course, if that's the way it works, then you have to reduplicate your murderous impulse in order to murder. Sorry. Okay. Freud develops the idea of conscience in civilization and its discontents along these lines, showing that destructiveness is now directed against internal destructiveness, and because it cannot fully destroy its own destructiveness, it can intensify its operation as a superegoic unleashing, as a kind of self-cruelty. The superego becomes a cruel psychic mechanism. The more intensely it seeks to renounce murderous impulse, the more murderous it becomes. At such a moment, aggression, even violence, is prohibited, but it's not destroyed and it's not done away with. In a sense, Freud is asking an earlier version of the question that I'm posing here: what leads any of us to seek to preserve the life of the other? But asking that question negatively, what, if anything, in psychic life keeps us from doing damage when we are in the grip of murderous wish. There is, I want to suggest, an alternative that psychoanalytic thinking opens up for us, and it's an affirmative way of trying to answer that question, or maybe reposing the question. What, if anything, in psychic life becomes animated when we actively seek to safeguard the life of another? Returning to the problem of substitution, we can ask, how do unconscious forms of substitution come to form what we might call moral sentiments? What conditions the possibility of putting oneself in the place of the other without precisely taking over that place, or without precisely being engulfed by the other? What makes it possible putting another in one's place without becoming overwhelmed by the other? Such forms of substitution demonstrate the ways that lives are implicated in one another from the start, and this insight gives us a way to understand that whatever ethic we adopt, it finally won't do to distinguish between preserving oneself and preserving the other, my life, your life, their lives. These are all implicated in one another. Melanie Klein, makes a psychoanalytic contribution to moral philosophy in her essay, Love, Guilt, and Reparation. There we find precisely in the dynamics of love and hate the site where individual and social psychology converge. Klein maintains that the desire to make people happy is linked with strong feelings of responsibility and concern, and what she calls genuine sympathy with other people involves putting ourselves in the place of other people. To do this, she argues, identification is necessary. It brings us as close as we can get to the possibility of altruism. She writes, and I quote, "We are only able to disregard or to some extent sacrifice our own feelings and desires, and thus for a time to put the other person's feelings and desires first, if we have the capacity to identify ourselves with the loved person." This disposition is not a full self-abnegation, for in seeking the happiness of the one we love, we are understood to share in that person's satisfaction. A vicarious moment intervenes in the act of putting the other first, such that we regain in one way what we have sacrificed in another. At this moment in her argument, Klein makes a remark. It's actually in a footnote, as if it doesn't matter, but it really does matter. As I said at the beginning of my essay, there is a constant interaction of love and hate in each of us. She remarks that although she is now focusing on love in this text, she wants to make clear that aggression is co-present, and that both aggression and hatred can be productive, that we should not be surprised to find that people very capable of loving can and do also manifest these other feelings. She makes clear that in giving to others, and even in protecting them, we reenact the ways in which we have ourselves been treated by parents, for instance, or we reenact the fantasy about how we wish we had been treated, right? I love someone in the way that I should have been loved and was not loved. She keeps these two options open. She writes, ultimately, in making sacrifices for somebody we love and in identifying ourselves with the loved person, we play the part of the good parent and behave towards this person as we felt at times the parents did to us or as we wanted them to do. So though she has told us that genuine sympathy with another is possible, and further that it involves the ability to understand them as they are and as they feel, it is established through modes of identification that involve playing a role, even replaying a role within a phantasmatic scene in which one is positioned as the child or as the parent, as they were or as they should have been, which is the same as one wished they were. In fact, Klein goes on to assert, at the same time, we also play the part of the good child toward his parents, which he wished to do in the past and are now acting out in the present. Now, I have many problems with Klein's family politics, but let's just follow her argument and then we can move it into another sphere. Let us note, for instance, that in the moment of what Klein identifies as vicarious identifying, essential to the effort to make another happy, even to give moral priority to another over ourselves, we are role-playing and reenacting some unmourned losses or some unfulfilled wishes. She concludes the discussion this way by reversing a situation, namely, in acting towards another person as a good parent. In fantasy, we recreate and enjoy the wished-for love and goodness of our parents, end quote. At this point, it's unclear whether we had that good love and then we lost it when we became older, or perhaps we only wished for that good love that we did not really have, or at least that did not really fulfill our wishes. It seems now to matter whether in our vicarious and giving modalities, in which we give moral priority to the other, we are actually mourning what we once had, or wishing for a past we never had, or even experiencing a bit of both. At the point where Klein imports the discussion of aggression from the footnotes back to the text, she writes, "But to act as good parents towards other people may also be a way of dealing with the frustrations and sufferings of the past, our grievances against our parents for having frustrated us, together with the feelings of hate and revenge to which these have given rise in us, and again the feelings of guilt and despair arising out of this hate and revenge because we have injured the parents whom at the same time we loved. All these, in fantasy, we may undo in retrospect, taking away some of the grounds for hatred by playing at the same time the parts of loving parents and loving children." Complex, end of quote. So a discussion that begins with the assertion that genuine sympathy is possible through modes of identification develops into an exposition of how in treating others well and seeking to secure their happiness, we, each of us, replay our grievances against those who did not love us well enough or whose good love we have unacceptably lost. At the same time, according to this same logic, one is able now to be the good child one was not, or rather could not have been, given the waves of aggression that overwhelmed all those early efforts to be good. So I am, as it were, working out my losses and grievances, even expiating my guilt when I engage in what Klein calls genuine sympathy. I put the other first, but my scene establishes all the roles that I or you can play. Perhaps it is all quite easy. I am only sharing in the satisfaction that I give the other because I love the other, and what the other feels, I feel as well, genuine sympathy. If so, we have to wonder whether the other to whom I give my love is ever free of those scenarios that I am replaying on the other's time, reconstituting what I have lost or what I never had, or working out the guilt I have accrued, having sought or seeking still to destroy the other, even if only in fantasy. Is my sympathy motivated by my loss and guilt, or is it the case that in sharing the other's happiness that I help to bring about, the I and the you prove to be not quite as distinct as we might have thought? If they are sharing, what precisely do they share? When Klein concludes this discussion by claiming that making reparation is fundamental to love, she gives us another way to think about sympathy. Even as I have sympathy for another, perhaps for the reparation that another never received for a loss or for a deprivation, it seems that I am, at the same time, making reparation for what I never had or how I should have been cared for. In other words, I move toward the other, but I repair myself, and neither one of these motions takes place without the other. If identification involves playing out my losses, to what extent can it serve as the basis for a genuine sympathy? Is there always something ingenuine in the effort to make another happy, something self-preoccupied? And does this mean as well that identification with another is never quite successful if one condition of its possibility is a fantasy of self-reparation, right? The most cynical version would be, I seem to be loving someone, but actually I'm involved in self-reparation. In these passages, Klein comes to focus on grievance and guilt, but grievance makes sense only in light of the claim that one has been deprived in the past. The deprivation may come in the form of loss. I once had a love and now no longer do. Or it may come in the form of reproach. I never had that love and surely should have had such love. Guilt in these passages seems to be linked with feelings of hatred and aggression. Whether or not one literally tore at or tore apart the parent, the fantasy is operative, and the child does not always know whether it was a fantasy of destruction or an actual deed. The continuing presence of the targeted parent does not suffice as living proof that the child is not a murderer, nor apparently is abundant documentation that the deceased parent died by natural causes. For the child, there is this murdered person living on in a more or less inexplicable way, sometimes under the same roof, or sometimes the child is the murdered person who is inexplicably living on. We could think about Kafka's Odradek in Cares of a Family Man. Indeed, we cannot understand the reparative trajectory of identification without first understanding the way that sympathetic identification, according to Klein, is wrought from efforts to replay and reverse scenes of loss, deprivation, and the kind of hatred or aggression that follows from non-negotiable dependency. Klein writes, my psychoanalytic work has convinced me that when in the baby's mind, the conflicts between love and hate arise and the fears of losing the loved one become active, a very important step is made in development. At issue is the fact that the fantasy of destroying the mother begets the fear of losing the very one on whom the infant is fundamentally dependent. To do away with the mother would be to imperil the conditions of one's own existence. The two lives seem to be bound together. I quote, "There is in the unconscious mind a tendency to give her up, to give the mother up, which is counteracted by the urgent desire to keep her forever." Okay. The baby is no calculating creature. I'm never sure why Klein thinks she knows what's inside the baby's mind, but okay. It's a scene. I take it as a kind of scene, the so-called baby's mind. There is at some primary level a recognition that one's own life is bound up with this other life. And though this dependency changes form as the baby becomes child and adolescent and adult, I would suggest that this is the psychoanalytic basis for a theory of the social bond. No matter how much we might want to do away with another, we find that our own lives are fundamentally dependent on that other, and we would be, by destroying the other, imperiling the conditions of our own existence. In that way, we are bound to one another. It is because if we seek to preserve each other's lives, it's not only because it's in my interest to do so, and I've calculated on the basis of self-interest, and it's not because I've wagered that it will bring about better consequences for me. It's not a utilitarian argument. It's because we are already tied together in a social bond that precedes and makes possible both of our lives. And if we damage one another, we damage that bond. Guilt has to be understood then not simply as a way of checking one's own destructiveness. It's a mechanism for safeguarding the life of the other. Now, I don't want to be praising guilt, I assure you. So stay with me for a moment. When it turns into a safeguarding action, I'm not sure it should still be called guilt. If we still use that term, we could conclude that guilt is strangely generative, or that its productive form, perhaps its productive name, is reparation. But safeguarding is yet another future-directed modality, a kind of anticipatory care, looking out for another life that actively seeks to preempt the damage we might cause or that might be caused. Of course, reparation is not strictly tied to what has happened in the past. It might be undertaken for a damage I only wished to inflict, but never did. Safeguarding seems to do something else. It establishes conditions for the possibility of a life to become livable, perhaps even to flourish. And in this sense, safeguarding is not quite the same as preserving, though the former presupposes the latter. Preserving seeks to secure the life that already is. Safeguarding secures and reproduces the conditions of becoming, of living, of futurity, where the content of that life, that living, can be neither prescribed nor predicted, and where self-determination emerges as a possibility. So what does it mean to safeguard the conditions of the self-determination for another self? Klein famously and repeatedly tells us that the infant feels great gratification at the mother's breast, but also great urges of destructiveness. In the presence of its own aggressive wishes, the infant fears that it has in fact destroyed the object, which, as we know, is the one whom he, we'll keep the pronoun, loves and needs most, and on whom he is entirely dependent. At another moment, the infant is said not only to feel guilt about losing the mother or the one on whom he is most dependent, but also distress, indicating an anxiety that belongs to a felt sense of radical helplessness. In the last analysis, she writes, it is the fear that the loved person, to begin with the mother, may die because of the injuries inflicted upon her in fantasy, which makes it unbearable to be dependent on this person. Takes us back to Robinson Crusoe. Why? This idea that dependency is absolutely unbearable. Well, what Klein is telling us that the dependency on another for one's own life is unbearable, especially when one has aggressive or destructive wishes towards that other. This unbearable dependency persists, delineating a social bond that has something unbearable at the core, but that nevertheless has to be preserved. Indeed, it's unbearable enough to give rise to a murderous rage, but one which, if acted out, given the dependency of one on the other, takes them both down at once. And the reason we can't stay within this dyad, by the way, is we're asked to understand the child who's unmanageably dependent upon the parent against whom there is aggression, for whom there is also love. But that parent is also unmanageably dependent on a world or on a set of others as well, right? It's not as if that only works one way or is, in fact, asymmetrical. It's why the dyadic analysis gives us some way of opening up this question, but it can never remain purely dyadic if we are to elaborate this as a social philosophy or as a social and political ethic of some kind. Significantly, and perhaps paradoxically, the desire to give to the other, to make sacrifices for her, emerges from this recognition that if one destroys her, one imperils one's own life. The child begins to repair the breach she understands herself to have instigated or imagined, or perhaps repair the breach that is yet to come and to counter destructiveness through repair. If I seek to repair her, I understand myself to have damaged her, or perhaps to have enacted a murder at a psychic level. In this way, I do not disavow my destructiveness, but I seek to reverse its damaging effects. It's not that destructiveness converts into repair, but that I repair even as I am driven with destructiveness, or I repair precisely to the extent that I am driven by destructiveness. And precisely because I am so driven, whatever sacrifices I make are part of the trajectory of reparation, and yet reparation is not an effective solution. Jacqueline Rose notes, reparation can reinforce omnipotence and moreover sometimes emerges within Kleinian theory as a developmental, if not a disciplinary requirement and imperative. Reparation is fallible and ought to be distinguished from efforts to rewrite and so deny the past. Reparation cannot be revisionism. Such a form of hallucinatory denial may serve the purpose of dissociating from or reversing a psychic legacy of dependency and distress, and that can produce what they call a schizoid condition. The psychoanalytic answer to the question of how to curb human destructiveness that we find in Freud focuses on conscience and guilt, instruments that recircuit the death drive, holding the ego accountable for its deeds by a superego that lashes out with absolute moral imperatives, cruel punishments, and definitive judgments of failure. But this logic in which one's destructive impulses are curbed through internalization seems to find its culminating moment in a self-lacerating conscience or negative narcissism, as we saw in Freud. But in Klein, that inversion or negative dialectic spawns another possibility, which is the impulse to preserve that other life. Guilt turns out not to be fully self-referential, but one way to preserve a relation to another. In other words, guilt can no longer be understood as a form of negative narcissism that cuts the social tie. I'm so guilty I can't relate to anyone, but rather the occasion for the articulation of that very bond. Klein gives us a way to understand the important way that guilt marshals the destructive impulse for the purpose of preserving the other and myself, an act that presupposes that one life is not thinkable without the other. For Klein, this inability to destroy the one life without destroying the other operates at the level of fantasy. Although the developmental account presumes infant and mother, can we not say that this ambivalent form of the social bond takes a more general form once the interdiction against murder becomes an organizing principle of social life? After all, that primary condition in which survival is ensured through an already partially intolerable dependency does not exactly leave us as we age. Indeed, it often becomes more emphatic as we age and enter into, alas, new forms of dependency that recall the primary ones, entering into housing and institutional arrangements accompanied by caregivers if they still exist and if we can afford them in the United States. Nobody can afford them. Okay. We saw how, in the consequentialist scenario, each of us concludes that it's really not in our best interest to go about killing those for whom we feel antipathy or emotional ambivalence, since then others who feel antipathy toward us may well get the idea and decide to take one's own life or the life of another, since we would not be able to universalize any rule governing that mode of conduct without jeopardizing the very rationality that distinguishes us as humans. That's the problem that the Kantians have identified. In different ways, each of these positions elaborates a scenario in which we're asked to duplicate or replicate our actions, imagining others in our position, or projecting ourselves into the position of others, and then to consider and evaluate the action we propose to ourselves in light of that experiment. For Klein, however, we are from the start, and quite without deliberation, in a situation of substituting ourselves for another or finding ourselves as substitutes. And that reverberates throughout adult life. I love you, but you are already me, carrying the burden of my unrepaired past, my deprivation, and my destructiveness. And I am doubtless that for you, taking the brunt of punishment for what you never received. We are for one another already faulty substitutions for irreversible pasts, neither one of us ever really getting past the desire for repairing what cannot be repaired. And yet, here we are, hopefully sharing a decent glass of wine. Life as we know it, Freud tells us in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, is too hard for us. I've been saying that a lot lately. This explains the need, well, I live under the Trump regime. This explains the need for various forms of narcosis, including, of course, art. People forget that art is a form of important narcosis during difficult times. Carrying the burden of ungrievable loss, intolerable dependency, and irreparable deprivation, we seem to be, in what we call our relations, spinning out scenarios of need of repair and seeking to repair through various forms of giving. It is perhaps a persistent dynamic in which polarities such as giving and receiving or safeguarding and repairing are not always distinct. Who is acting is not always separable from who is acted upon. Perhaps this kind of morally and sensuously fecund ambiguity constitutes us in a potentially common way. If my continuing existence depends upon another, then I am here, separated from the one on whom I depend, but also, quite crucially, over there, ambiguously located here and there, whether in feeding or sleeping or being touched or held. In other words, the separateness of the infant is in some ways a fact, but in significant ways a struggle, a negotiation, if not a relational bind. That is why, in the beginning, there are no individuals. There is only a conflicted and difficult individuation process. There is always some measure of distress and lack of gratification, no matter how good the parenting, since that other body cannot be there at every possible moment. So hatred for the ones upon whom one is intolerably dependent is surely part of what is meant by the destructiveness that invariably surges forth in relations of love. How then does this translate into a more general principle, one that might lead us back to the questions of what keeps us from killing, what leads us to preserve the life of the other? Could it be that even now, in destroying another, we are also destroying ourselves? If so, it is because this I that I am has only ever been ambiguously differentiated, one for whom differentiation is a perpetual struggle and problem. Klein and Hegel seem to converge here. I encounter you, but encounter myself there as you, reduplicated in my disrepair. And I myself am not just me, but a specter I receive from you, searching for a different history than the one you had. Thus, the I lives in a world in which dependency is not eradicable without eradicating its own self. Some abiding truth of infantile life continues to inform our political lives, as well as the forms of dissociation and deflection out of which fantasies of sovereign self-sufficiency are born. This is one reason why Jacqueline Rose has suggested that if we want to avoid going to war, we should hang on to forms of derision and failure that preempt or undercut forms of triumphalism and forms of sovereignty. We may think that a genuine sympathy requires that I understand myself as quite separate from you, but it may be that my capacity not to be me, to play the role, as Klein says, even to act out the place of the other, is part of who I am. It comes with me. It is what allows me to sympathize with you, and this means that in identification, I am partly comported beyond myself in you. I am given over, and what you levy in my direction is carried by me. So there is some way we are lodged in one another. I'm not only the precipitate of all those I have loved and lost, but the legacy of all those who failed to love me well as all the ones I imagine to have successfully kept me away from that intolerably early distress over my survival and that apparently unbearable guilt and anxiety over the destructive potential of my rage. And I endeavor to become the one who seeks to secure the conditions of your life and to survive whatever rage you feel about a dependency you cannot flee. Indeed, we all live, more or less, with a rage over a dependency from which we cannot free ourselves without freeing, or destroying, rather, the conditions of social and psychic life itself. But if we can imagine this dependency within personal life and intimate forms of dependency, can we not also understand that we are dependent on institutions and economies without which we cannot persist as the creatures that we are? Further, how might this perspective work to think about war, political violence, the abandonment of populations to disease or to death. The moral precept that prohibits killing has perhaps to be expanded to a political principle that seeks to safeguard lives through institutional and economic means, and to do so in a way that fails to distinguish between populations that are imminently grievable and those who are not. I hope to elaborate this view in the third lecture, suggesting that a consistent and expansive conception of grievable life promises to revise our notions of equality in light of both biopolitics and the logics of war. The point is not only to find ways to repair the damage we have done, though that is surely important, or even the damage we believe we have done, but to anticipate and forestall the damage that is yet to come. For that purpose, an anticipatory form of repair has to be mobilized, an active form of safeguarding existing life for its unknowable future. We might say, without that open future, an existing life is merely existing but not living. My wager is that we sometimes do not act violently, not simply because we calculate that someone else might do the same, and not because it's in our best interest not to do so. The reason, rather, is to be found in that conflicted social condition that lays the ground for subject formation within the world of pronouns. This I, that I am, is already social, already bound to a social world that exceeds the domain of familiarity, both urgent and largely impersonal. I first become thinkable in the mind of the other as you, or as a gendered pronoun, and that phantasmatic ideation gives birth to me as a social creature. The dependency that constitutes what I am prior to the emergence of any pronoun underscores the fact that I depend on the one whose definition first gives me form. My gratitude is doubtless mixed with some understandable rage. And yet ethics emerges here, since I am bound to preserve those conflicted bonds without which I myself would not exist and would not be fully thinkable. Thus, the matter of working with conflict becomes key. Handling ambivalence becomes paramount, precisely in order to keep rage from taking violent forms. If all lives are considered equally grievable, the political world ought rightly to be organized such that this principle is affirmed in the governance of economic and institutional life. And that would involve an anticipatory safeguarding against the destruction of which we ourselves are capable. This is something different from protecting the vulnerable by strengthening forms of paternalistic power. After all, that strategy always arrives late and fails to address the differential production of vulnerability. But if a life from the start is regarded as grievable, then every precaution will be taken to safeguard it against its harm and destruction. It's notoriously difficult to get the message across that those who are targeted or abandoned or condemned are also grievable, that their losses would or will matter, and that the failure to preserve their lives will be the occasion of immense regret and obligatory repair. What disposition, then, allows us to establish the anticipatory powers of regret and remorse such that our present and future actions might forestall a future we will come to lament? In Greek tragedy, lament seems to follow rage and is usually belated. But sometimes there is a chorus, some anonymous group of people gathering and chanting in the face of someone else's propulsive rage, who lament in advance, mourning as soon as they see it coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing your thinking with us and for asking these difficult and important questions. So looking forward to more of these tomorrow. But we have 20 minutes, perhaps a bit longer, for questions. if that's all right. But
Great.
we said that we might start by you reading out some questions.
Yes,
that
I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, members of the audience.
I'm going to
left
be a
yesterday.
little briefer, which means I'm less thoughtful, for which I'm sorry in advance. Someone said, wrote to me, would I be able to comment on our interdependency with non-living creatures? Is it possible to be violent against the non-living entities, I'm sorry. Is it possible to be violent against the non-living? And can we have injunctions to protect them? Non-living entities. Well, I do think that we have obligations toward the dead. Not everybody agrees with that. I also think we have obligations toward the environment, that is, for the most part, living. I also think we have obligations towards built environments that give us the infrastructural conditions of life. So in that sense, I would say that our obligations are not, strictly speaking, only to other living creatures. Among living creatures, I would certainly include animals, and there is much more that can be done within this framework regarding animal life. What do I think about the term moral circle expansion? To me, it assumes that there's a center who includes, and the worthiness of that center is presumed. Well, if I understand moral circle expansion, then who belongs to my moral circle? To whom am I obligated morally? And one would begin with those who are most intimate, I presume, and then the idea would be to expand those circles so that it came to include the entire globe. But the problem perhaps with that idea is that I'm also on the outskirts of somebody else's circle, and that we have a bunch of subject-centered creatures who are trying to expand rather than perhaps think of ourselves as interrelated or as relational, which would involve a decentering of the subject itself. And my commitment for some time has been that ethical relationality actually involves going outside of an ego-logical framework, which is part of what I'm trying to do here. A third question, can I elaborate on the contradiction or the antagonism between interdependency as an ethics rooted in relationships and the abstraction of caring in terms of global responsibility? Doesn't abstracted caring suck the energy out of concrete useful caring? Isn't the real question how to create social conditions for concrete caring to take place rather than invest in the bureaucratization of caring, which might just become a rhetorical gesture that signifies me as someone who cares, which merely affirms me as an individual in social competition, thus replicating the liberal creation myth? Well, Katja has something to say here, much more than I do. What I would say is that sometimes it is true that in caring industries, it may well be that there's a personal sense of care, or somebody arrives paid to offer personal care. It doesn't mean that there is love. It doesn't mean that that's a personal relationship, but there is still someone there to administer basic functions that keep someone alive. And I have found that, of course, some people claim, well, true care only happens among intimates, right? The family, those who are most close. But in fact, I believe caring as a social obligation is much broader than that. We need many economic solutions, especially not just for people who live outside of family units, and many people do, especially as we age. Sometimes we end up the last one standing. Everyone's gone who was supposed to take care of us. I mean, institutionalization is not, I think, bad. Bureaucratization is not by itself terrible. I don't think we can hold to the idea that everyone should be cared for all the time by those who know them best or who are personally interdependent. Most caring structures are a mix of personal and impersonal. And I personally look forward to the impersonal. I think it would be unbearable to have the people I know taking care of me all the time. I want a perfectly nice stranger, okay? Remember that, okay? Okay, someone asks me about the recent controversy around Professor Avital Ronell at New York University and the letter I signed in her defense. You might want to comment on this, or you might not want to comment on this. Okay, I have a comment. As some of you may know, I signed a letter that was authored by several people asking that Professor Avital Ronell not be removed from her position at New York University. At that time, I understood that she had been exonerated of all charges that would have merited removal from the position. I did not have access to the file and did not understand the facts of the case, and so I made a serious error in helping to craft and sign that letter. I should not have intervened. Why didn't I know better? Well, I had known the accused for many years, and the accusations didn't seem credible to me on the basis of my experience. How many of us end up saying that? But no, not that person. No, couldn't be. But in fact, the matter is much more complex than I knew, so I have only myself to blame by jumping to a conclusion and taking action too quickly. Now, what is most important to reflect upon is to understand that graduate students are in a structurally vulnerable position. They depend on faculty to learn, but also for mentorship on how to become a scholar, a professor, how to enter a difficult market, how to find a living doing the academic work that is most valuable to them. As faculty, we are obligated to draw a line and not engage in any form of emotional exploitation of their dependency on us, or of any form of sexual harassment. Students cannot cater to our material needs, they cannot do our domestic tasks, they cannot be asked to do anything other than what is in their best interest for their studies and for their future. The line we draw against intimacy, and it is our obligation to draw that line, no matter how consensual that intimacy may seem, is there precisely to make sure that faculty are fully dedicated to the well-being and flourishing of their students in the work that I hope to do within academic professional organizations in the United States. I want to support graduate students and other precarious workers within the academy, insisting on their right to study and be mentored without harassment of any kind, and to develop a graduate student Bill of Rights that makes clear why every student deserves to be treated with the utmost dignity. I made an error, but I hope to make reparation by supporting the rights of those who are often the most vulnerable in the academy. Thank you. I probably don't deserve your applause, but thank you. In any case, do we only have a global obligation to other people until we have achieved a state of equality which recognizes our interdependency? Would this state of equality mean we don't have any violence anymore, meaning that our global obligation disappears? No, because equality, like democracy, is a constant struggle. There are always efforts to undermine equality. There are always efforts to undermine freedom. There are always efforts to undermine democracy. It is a constant struggle. Angela Davis tells us that. Chantal Mouffe has shown us that. Our capacity for aggression, I believe, does come with the fact of our social interdependency. It arises from it. It is part of it. I don't think it goes away. So to the degree that that also is always there to be crafted, to be rerouted, to be known and to be restrained, we will have a constant struggle there as well. It won't mean we don't have the prospect of violence anymore. I believe the prospect of violence goes with us. And then I got a wonderful one that was in a graphic form. In light of the Kavanaugh hearings in the US, how do you think your discussion of the umbrella of the self in relation to self-defense applies to this internet meme? She's someone's wife, daughter, sister, something like that, where activists push against the argument, surely meant to excess reticent men, that we should oppose rape because it could happen to these possible extensions of ourselves, our daughter, our mother, our aunt, whatever. Well, maybe you don't care about your aunt, but you know. Well, let's hope you do, okay. But yes, I think that argument, I mean, the fact of the matter is rape should not happen to any woman, whether you know them or don't know them. And it cannot be the case that you oppose rape only on the condition that you can imagine that woman as your daughter or your mother, because kinship humanizes or entitles someone to rights that non-kinship does not, right? Because what the analogy does is it fortifies the presumption that those who are our kin or those who are most proximate are the ones we give rights of self-protection to, rights rights against rape, rights against rights not to be raped, rights not to be damaged or hurt or murdered. But the fact is that that needs to be generalized, and it cannot depend on the kinship analogy. So I'm actually opposed to it. It can be pedagogically a good way to begin, but then it needs to go beyond itself. Okay, do I have one final one here? To what extent can a nonviolent ethics of precariousness and radical interdependency be a viable way towards a leftist socialist project that seeks to eliminate socioeconomic inequality, when the language of precariousness, I am vulnerable, we are vulnerable, is being increasingly co-opted by far-right populism and exploitative capitalism? Well, we have to be careful and think a little bit about how the language of vulnerability works, right? I mean, right-wing men on my campus have stood up and said, we are the minority. You know, we are the minority. Or we are oppressed, or we are censored, or we are most vulnerable, right? And these are very often people who hold to explicitly fascist views or explicitly racist views, but they feel that in the present democracy, their views are not heard, or they are systematically excluded, that they are the marginalized. Now, do we say, oh, well, we need another language. We can't use marginalization anymore. We can't use oppression anymore. We can't use vulnerability anymore because they've taken it over. No, 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 they're just temporarily poaching, right? We take it back. We take it back, right? This is language that can be reworked, and we take it back and we make it stronger, and we elaborate its use, and we also expose their use as their way of mourning their loss of privilege, right? Because that's what they're mourning. They have not become the underprivileged. They are shocked at the fact that they are losing their privilege, right? And that's what we saw with the blustering Kavanaugh. How could anybody accuse me? Have you seen my resume? I'm just a guy who drinks. I drink. All right. So in any case, I mean, I think we fight back, but we do not say, oh, they've taken the language of vulnerability, therefore we can't use it. No, we do a better job with it. We do a more encompassing job, and we come up with an alternative analysis of that expropriation, right? Take it back. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we take some questions from the floor? Right. Can we take this woman here in the green hoodie first, and then that person over there in Kumud? Yeah. In the blue. Okay.
Thank you so much for those 2 days so far. I would like to ask you about, as you just said, like, violence will always come with us, so we can say that people will always make mistakes, in a way. How do we deal with punishment then? Because what we have at the moment about punishment, so when we think about prison and things like that, when we think about, okay, we do not kill people, but we imprison them and we throw them in a way away, we abandon them. And in prison, we know what can happen, and there is more violence. And then, so how do we deal with punishment in your non-violent way?
Yes, thank you. Well, I don't mean to postpone the answer to that question, which is a really important question. But in the third lecture, I proposed to talk about legal violence and what it means to try to respond to extra-legal violence with legal violence. And we need to think, I believe, about prison systems and even court systems as ways of distributing violence and exercising violence. I will talk a little bit about the systematic violence of carceral states and the increasing normalization of carceral strategies as modes of containing certain kinds of populations. I think it's even a broader question about democracy, who's allowed to be part of the people, who's allowed to be part of the public, who's allowed to vote. And containment, prison, incarceration, detention are all ways of distinguishing between the population that belongs to the demos, as it were, and the population that has its rights suspended. So I will talk about that. I think if I had more time, we could talk about restorative justice and how that relates to the notion of anticipatory repair that I've been working with here. I do tend to follow Angela Davis on these matters. And I learned from her and the history she tells, and also the vision of restorative justice that she commends. So that's my brief way of at least touching on your very important topic.
Judith, would you like to take one or two questions together?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. As a child, the person I wanted to murder most was not my mother, but my sister.
Ah, yes. Juliet Mitchell has a book for you.
Well, yeah. And I guess I was thinking of Mitchell as you were talking, and her proposition that psychoanalysis take up the lateral relation of the sibling in order to understand broader social relations, and its helpfulness in thinking about, for example, the fraternity or the brotherhood, or in feminism, the sisterhood. And I guess my question is why the decision to rely upon Klein's horizontal proposition of the parent or particularly mother-child relationship rather than the lateral relationship or the horizontal that Mitchell poses?
Well, first of all, it's a great question, and I very much appreciate what Juliet Mitchell has done with siblings and thinking about horizontal relations. I think the only reason I turned to Klein is because of the way she foregrounds this strange desire to preserve the life of the other from my own aggression, because I depend on that other and my life is actually not thinkable without that other. So there's the elaboration of a social bond that has to be preserved. It's not just my particular life that I'm interested in preserving. It's that this bond is the condition of life. And it's not, and so what I would want to do ideally is say, look, it's not just the mother-child dyad in which that truth appears to be the case. I think, in fact, global interdependency might actually be the very situation in which we live in massively conflicted relations. There's enormous hostility. There's general disbelief we have to live in the world with these other people. But we do. Hannah Arendt tells us that there are these relations of unchosen cohabitation, and that we're really not allowed to destroy those, even though we didn't enter into them by contract. And it was Eichmann's mistake to think that he could. So, I'm actually trying to understand that relationship of dependency and the social bond and even the moral obligation that emerges from it, and to take it out of the dyad. I do think Mitchell's way of doing it is a fine one, and I also, I have my own ways of thinking how we might move beyond the Oedipal and the pre-Oedipal and the maternal dyad. But I couldn't elaborate it here, but it's a fine point. Thank you.
Yeah, first, thank you for the great talk. I was here yesterday and I was quite amazed as today. And I was thinking, yesterday you talked about the global obligations. I was thinking about alliances. And today you talked about anticipatory safeguarding. And maybe this is a more activist question, but I was wondering what effects come along with the practice of a grievable life, grieving a non-grievable body in public, making it visible. Could there be an effect? Would you consider that important?
Yes, I mean, I think that, well, look, you know, I think this question of grievability, I mean, it was there in my early work. I think even perhaps in gender trouble, I was concerned about loves that couldn't be marked as loves, and so when they were lost, they couldn't be openly grieved. And there I was thinking about the massive number of gay men and sex workers who had died of AIDS, and the efforts to achieve public memorialization for those lives. But after 9/11 in the United States, it became very clear to me that some people were actively, if not iconically, grieved. People who had worked in the World Trade Center, for instance. But then many of the workers who were from Latin America weren't named or weren't actively grieved, or, you know, how many people there were undocumented who were cleaning that building. And it seemed to me that the lives that were actively grieved had property, they had dogs, they had children, and they generally were married in a heterosexual mode. And it seemed to me there was a reconstitution of family and nation happening through some of those obituaries. Now, all those people, even the ones I'm describing right now, are deserving of public grief. I don't think they ought not to be grieved because they're property owners. My Marxism doesn't go that far. But there was a kind of effacement, and there was an idea of who's the grievable and who's not. And then the immediate kind of killings are bombings. And then there were all these nameless people who were then killed by American bombs, right? And that was supposed to be the case. And they weren't worthy of being named, and they were the enemy. And that was the fault of those other people who had harbored the terrorists, who turned out not to have harbored the terrorists, right? Or who had weapons of mass destruction, who turned out not to, whatever. So I think there's a question of who we are, who are the people. There's a question of racism and of classism and of citizenship, the privilege of citizenship. All of those inequalities were brought out, right? So the right to be grieved is also the right to exist publicly as a life that was lived and that was lost and that ought not to have been lost. And then, you know, I think there's like another question altogether, a kind of a third phase, as it were, like who can be killed with impunity, and the person who does the killing is immediately exonerated. And at least it seems to me that there are war logics and there are modes of systemic racism that allow certain populations to be simply dismissed or lost from the world of the living without much of a mark, and sometimes no mark at all. So these are questions of profound inequality, and I think that if we think about grievability as a problem of equality, it changes how we think about equality. It doesn't take away from economic inequality. It is indeed one lived permutation of economic inequality, as it were. And it gives us perhaps a phenomenological access to that reality in another way.
Thank you.
Long answer, long answer.
There's a question.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is, do you think somebody should be more grievable over others? Because I think you tend to answer no, because you seem to argue that everyone should be equally grievable. This idea is quite against the East Asian Confucianism, because, for example, Huang Yangmin argued that it is natural and moral to grieve for your parents over a stranger. You should save your parents first and then a stranger. Mm-hmm. So what is your point?
Yes. Well, that's a serious challenge. Thank you. I'm told I'm more of a Taoist than a Confucianist, and I don't know if that means anything to you, but it's an interesting provocation for me. And maybe the reason why I've been called more of a Taoist than a Confucianist has to do with the way in which I think of interdependency and living relations. So of course, it feels natural to grieve one's parents more, and indeed, in many societies, it is a deep obligation to actively grieve and to have a ritual form of grieving for one's family. But one of the problems is that society is not structured only through the family unit. So how then do we think about the loss of those who are without families or outside of families or outside of our own family? Are their lives less valuable than the lives of people in my family? If we live in a social or political world in which we want to treat every life as equal, we want to say all lives are equal, and that would mean contesting certain ideas of hierarchy, which you are introducing here, then we have to consider that we may have obligations to those who are closest to us as well as to those who are very far away. And given the world that we're living in, unless we develop those forms of obligations towards those we do not know, whose language we do not speak, whose way of life we don't fully comprehend, we will end up in relations of enmity, or we will end up in relations that block them out or allow them to be abandoned or do not regard them as equally valuable. So I accept that there are strong epistemic challenges to many societies in the claim that I am making. But I think even those societies who could be governed by Confucianism, they could be governed by Hinduism, they could be governed by Buddhism, the place of the family and of the clan or the intimate society is also part of a broader world. So that there has to always be that question. I'm sorry I can't go further with your question, although it's a good one. Thank you.
Okay, I think we can take two more questions that have already been assigned. So, Kumud, if you could. Sure.
Thank you. Yesterday you spoke of global obligation, today to the grievability of the other, as well as notions of love. Do you think ideas like Rosie Brodotti's love of Zoe or love of life, as she explains in Transpositions, can play a role in such obligation? And if so, why? Or is love too troublesome a concept to bring into the egalitarian ethical imagination?
Well, I love Rosie Brodotti's work, and I love Brodotti's love of life, which does not mean it is mine. But I'm glad she's there, and I'm glad she has that, and I'm glad she writes that. It would be a more impoverished world if we did not have that position. So it's good. I don't think love is what binds us politically. I think that, I don't think we work out hatred and aggression and then arrive at a place of love. I think, perhaps with Freud, that love and hate are bound together in an ambivalent structure, which is what makes us into creatures who have to make difficult ethical decisions or craft difficult ethical practices, because we are drawn in destructive ways and it takes work in order to live a non-destructive life. So for me, I don't accept like Michael Hart's idea of love as what binds us, or that what happens in public assemblies is love. I think we're exhilarated to be there. We don't like the person next to us. We go to the political meeting. We believe in the justice, but we really hope we don't have to have dinner with that particular group of people on the left, you know. I mean, we are conflicted and we move forward, and we even move forward with joy. But I don't think conflict is ever out of the picture, which is why, for me, the techniques and the crafts of conflict resolution are exceedingly interesting, and they're open-ended, and they go with life itself. That's all I'll say about that right now, because I will talk about it next time.
Yeah, thank you. One final question, if you could be brief.
Thanks, I'll try to. I was struck by something you said at the near the beginning today, about how the creation of the vulnerable as a category creates this duality between the vulnerable and the non-vulnerable, or as the strange linguistic elision had it, the invulnerable. And whereas the concept of an invulnerable person is a bit impossible. But then, you know, every person who's vulnerable is vulnerable in a particular way, which I see as the value of an intersectional analysis of power and vulnerability in society. On the other hand, I think there's a danger in that analysis itself of adding to an individualized atomization, where to come to the kind of society that we want to have requires an understanding of interdependence, as you've been discussing. And I wondered if you could comment briefly on those two seemingly opposing poles.
Well, if I understand you correctly, you see a certain tension between the way of approaching vulnerability and the way of approaching interdependency. Is that part of it?
Yeah, slightly. Just in the in wanting to analyze vulnerability, it seems to me it always needs to be contextualized in a particular aspect.
Yes. Yes, that's true. Okay, well, let me make maybe a simplistic point first and try my best to address your question. First of all, I mean, vulnerability as a term is very strange. It actually comes from the word wound, right? So the ability to suffer a wound is what vulnerability means, I think, etymologically. And yet, when we call a group vulnerable, we act as if their vulnerability should be alleviated and that they should become free of vulnerability. And actually, they should be free to live their vulnerability without fear of injury. Right? And that's a very different thing, right? Because we don't want to come up with an idea of what groups should be, of what people should be. They should move from a state of vulnerability to a state of non-vulnerability, invulnerability. In other words, what is it? We don't want people's vulnerability to be exploited. We don't want their vulnerability to be heightened or exposed in ways that undermine them or imperil them. The problem is not vulnerability. If that were the case, we would be arguing for mastery or independence or invulnerability. Similarly, with dependency, the problem is not that certain people are dependent. The problem is that they are exploited in their dependency. Dependency is inevitable to some degree, but it can be lived in a dignified way. And it can be also lived in a potentially reciprocal way, right? Dependent in one situation and dependent on in another, or that kind of motion. So I don't want these terms to be devalued or a normative framework to emerge where we're trying to overcome our dependency to be independent or overcome our vulnerability to be invulnerable, because then we're back to Robinson Crusoe and the self-sufficient man, and that just won't work. I do think that the same kind of contextualization that vulnerability requires, vulnerability to what and under what conditions, right, always have to be answered. That's correct. Vulnerability is not a enclosed notion. It's always relational. It's always contextual. But the same is true of dependency and interdependency. I mean, I can call it a principle in a way, but every time I have to explain it, I not only have to give examples, but I show that the principle only makes sense as it is articulated in various kinds of social situations, social, economic, political, intimate, personal, medical. In any case, those are its necessary modalities, perhaps. All right, thank you for your patience.
For your question. Hope to see you all here tomorrow. Thank you.